All right. Thank you, Jess and Mackenzie, and welcome everyone to our Tech and Learning webinar. Today, we are discussing 10 things school district leaders need to know about creating a responsible AI policy, at the top of everybody's mind of late. Special thanks to our sponsor, Merlin Mind, for making this time together possible for us. So I know many of you in our audience today are facing the task of creating a responsible AI policy. And part of this is really understanding the different types of AI matters. So we're going to be talking about 10 critical aspects that are essential for creating this policy. So we're going to be breaking it down to data privacy, security, training and support, student well-being, and of course, some really specific strategies you can use when rolling out an AI policy in your district. Before I introduce our speaker, let's meet one another. So please put into chat your name, your school district, and where you're joining us from. So you can use Q&A down at the bottom there. We are super glad that you can be here today. So today we have our expert speaker is Lee Hall, and Lee serves as the Director of Research for Merlin Mind, which is a voice-enabled AI assistant, purpose-built for the classroom, and the winner of the recent Tech and Learning Best of ISTE Award. Congratulations. Lee has an extensive background in research, and she's going to be sharing some really practical tips to help you as you and your teams navigate this creation of AI policies in your school districts. Before I hand the presentation over to Lee, I just want to remind everybody, we really want to hear from you, so we love interaction. So please add your questions in the Q&A section below, and we will try to answer as many of the questions as we can after the conversation and presentation from Lee. And I suspect there will probably be many. But without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to Lee. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so today we're going to be covering 10 things that you need to know in order to create a responsible AI policy for your school or for your district. And these are the 10 topics that we're going to be covering. So we're going to talk about why are we even using AI in the first place, data privacy, bias and fairness, transparency and accountability. We're also going to be talking about how you develop a framework for AI procurement, educator training and support, student well-being, and then the last third, we're going to be focusing on parents and community engagement, evaluation and continuous improvement, and rollout plans. And as you just heard, if you have questions, please put them into the chat because we want to make sure that they get answered, and we will be answering them at the end. All right. So our first section is why are we using AI tools in the first place? So when you're thinking about writing an AI policy for your district, one of the things you're going to want to have right at the beginning is a rationale for why you want to integrate those technologies into your district's educational activities. So the people that want to learn about your policy, that want to read this policy document, they want to know a lot of the other things that we're going to cover around student well-being and teacher training and data privacy and security. But they're also going to want to know, why should we even be doing this in the first place? And so the things that you can think about when you're thinking about a rationale is AI can lead to enhanced learning opportunities. And it's really important that we start helping students develop the skills and the literacy abilities necessary to navigate within this AI-driven world, and understanding that these skills and what's needed to navigate it is really going to be shifting and changing as students are moving across K-12, and we need to be working right alongside them to help them continuously being develop and refine these skills. AI tools can increase efficiency. They can make teachers more efficient, which can make students more efficient in turn. And they create, or they have the potential to create, a more equitable and accessible learning environment. I keep hitting the arrow button thinking it's going to advance my slides, and it doesn't work that way. All right, so in terms of thinking about why AI, what's your rationale? Empowering educators is super critical because AI tools have the potential to really do that for teachers. They can be time-saving tools by streamlining administrative tasks, When you do that, right, when you can streamline administrative tasks for your teachers, you give them back time, right? It frees up their time. And what do they do with that time? Well, they can focus more on teaching. They can focus more on supporting students who might need more support. They can focus more on building relationships with students and families in the community and doing the things that they really love to do and that are meaningful and that are supportive and helpful for students and their families. It also allows for them to have resource optimization. So one of the things that we routinely hear from teachers is how difficult it is to find quality resources and how difficult it is, even if you find a resource or somebody gives you a resource, to know like just how good is this resource really? Like how well aligned is it to what I need it for? And, can I trust it? Is it telling me the right and correct things that my students need to hear? AI helps to optimize resource allocation. It helps teachers find resources quicker and faster, and it can help tailor them, right, to what teachers and students need in that moment. And that ends up ensuring that students receive the necessary support. They also receive the instruction that they need when they need it, right? And that's going to end up creating an inclusive or more inclusive learning environment for students. And then finally, AI tools can identify at-risk students early, right? They can through assessments, they can identify these students, they can enable timely interventions, they can suggest interventions, and they can provide personalized support so that those learning gaps, are shrunken or prevented entirely and student success happens. Okay, so enhancing educational outcomes. So one of the things that AI tools can do, they have the potential to do really well, is to improve student learning outcomes, right? They do this in a number of ways. One of the ways that they do this is through personalized learning paths, right? AI integration can enable personalized learning experiences, which is going to allow teachers to cater to diverse learning styles, diverse paces, right? Some kids move faster than others, and that shifts and changes depending on the content being taught. And ultimately, what this is going to do is help improve student engagement and knowledge retention. AI tools also give data-driven insights, right? So it allows teachers to address the variations in student learning. It allows teachers to give tailored, timely, well-focused interventions, and gives them the resources on top of that to support diverse learning profiles. So you can start to see how AI tools can really kind of come together to empower teachers, alleviate or lessen some of these administrative tasks, right? And get them back into the classroom alongside their students, able to do more with their students. And then finally, catering to diverse needs. So AI gives teachers the ability to, provide tailored interventions. Like I just said, I think I'm looking at this and I'm like, I think I missed that, right? This should say something different. And it says pretty much the exact same thing. So, but it does cater to diverse needs, right? Because it can provide tailored interventions. It can provide tailored resources. It can help you customize all of those things, which is going to help teachers be able to better address, right, those diverse needs in their classroom. All right. So then finally for this section, we have to keep in mind that we are preparing students for the future. So when we're thinking about this, why AI tools, why do we have to have them in the district? This is one of those reasons. Beyond empowering teachers, we are also empowering students by preparing them and setting them up well for the future. We're helping students with digital literacy, right? AI integration is going to give students essential digital literacy skills. It's going to help them learn the skills that they need to be in the workforce and empower them to navigate this technology-driven world. But it's also, if it's done well, can promote critical thinking. So one of the things that we've heard from teachers is that, one of the fears and concerns is that critical thinking in students is going to go down, right? Because you can just do whatever the AI tool tells you and you just take it from there and run with it. You don't have to think about it, right? If that's the stance that, someone takes, and of course, critical thinking is going to go down in students, but it does not have to be that way. AI tools can encourage critical thinking. They can encourage problem solving. They can foster a culture of innovation and adaptability among students. It's all in how you use the tool. So can AI tools support critical thinking? Absolutely. If the teacher guides students and helps them work to develop their critical thinking abilities, it can absolutely do that. Can you go the other way with it? Of course you can. But the potential is there, right, for critical thinking to be developed, and should be, I would say, in students in relation to these tools. And then finally, you have real world applications. So AI is going to expose students to real world applications of technology, how it's being used now, how people are thinking about using it, how it's being pushed to be used in the future. And ideally, it's going to inspire curiosity and creativity. Students are pretty excited when you bring these tools into the classroom, and they're pretty interested in learning how to engage with them and use them. And they get pretty excited when they hear about how those tools are going to help them. Okay. And we can use these tools to expose them to what's going on in the world now, help them develop these critical thinking and digital literacy skills, and prepare them, as I said, like for the workforce in the future. All right. So our next section is going to be covering addressing data privacy, security, and safety, which is usually the first concern or one of the top concerns that people have. So what you're going to want to do in your policy is explain how your district is going to approach data privacy and security. And so things that you're going to want to think about: protocols for collecting, storing, and managing student data in compliance with the relevant privacy laws and regulations. You're going to want to have a good outline for that. You're going to want to explain how you're going to ensure that AI systems employed by your district adhere to the strict data safety security standards so that you don't have unauthorized access or any data breaches. Now, that could still happen, right? Like the best systems in the world, right? You can still have an unauthorized access or a data breach. So you need to think also about, if an unauthorized access or a data breach should happen, what is our response, right? What is our plan that we put into place as soon as we know that that has happened? You're also going to want to provide clear criteria for determining when and how AI systems should be used. You're going to think about student privacy, consent from students, and autonomy, and what are students' rights, privacy, security, etc. inside these AI tools. Like, do they have to opt into things? Can they opt out of things? Where do you need consent? All of that needs to be outlined in this policy. And then clarify any roles and responsibilities for making sure that there's ethical AI use within your district. So ethical AI use, you might be asking, what does that mean exactly? And while we're not going to be diving into that too much here today, it is something to think through. In your district, what does ethical AI use look like, right? What do we consider unethical? What are we working to make sure doesn't happen? And what are we working to make sure does happen? You want to identify accountable parties responsible for overseeing the development, the deployment, and who's going to monitor the AI technologies. And like I said earlier, you want to make sure there's something in place for addressing ethical breaches or any kind of concerns that somebody might bring to you. How are those going to be addressed and responded to? All right. And then data protection measures. So you want to make sure that you have you're in compliance with any regulations that you need to be in compliance with, right? So all relevant data protection regulations, you need to ensure that student data is handled in compliance with privacy laws and ethical standards. You need to talk about how data is going to be stored and how it's going to be stored, and so that people feel comfortable and confident that it is securely stored. So you really want robust data encryption, and you want secure storage protocols to be implemented to make sure that student information, teacher information, right, whatever information that you are capturing is safeguarded. You want to explain how you're preventing those unauthorized accesses and data breaches. So you want a really strong, solid plan in place for how data is going to be stored. And I would also say, on the other side of that, is there a point where that data is no longer, how long do you keep that data for? At what point is that data no longer relevant? And when and how will it will be disposed of? And then access control. Who gets access to any of the data that you collect? So the assumption here is that student data is going to be strictly controlled. You're going to have different people who have different roles are going to be able to access it, right? So as a teacher, if I'm a 7th grade English teacher, then I should be able to access, or should I be able to access the data for all of my students? Or should I only be able to access some of the data that my students have, put into the system? So you need to figure out who has access to what, and how you're going to authenticate that to make sure that, the right person gets access, but the person who shouldn't get access obviously can't get access. So make sure that you have a data security system in place and that you feel really confident and strong and secure about it. Okay, ethical data use. So I talked about this a little bit a minute ago when I said, right, the ethical and ethical use in AI. We're going to talk about it a little bit here. It's something that I encourage you to think about and talk about a little more, because I think it's very important, especially when you're setting up a policy, to be very clear on what those lines in the sand are and what is considered ethical versus unethical use, and where some gray areas may even come up for you, and to be able to have discussions about those up front while you're writing this policy, I think is really important. So informed consent. So what does consent look like? What information needs to be communicated? Who does that information need to be communicated to? Who is giving consent, and what are they giving consent for? So you need transparent communication, obtaining informed consent from parents, from guardians, and also potentially from students themselves. So the students at a certain age, and it varies depending on state, but at a certain age, the students can give consent. And at a certain age, the students can give assent. And so sometimes you might need consent from both parents and students. Sometimes maybe just students is enough, depending on the state guidelines and their age. And sometimes you might need both consent and assent from your students, again, depending on their age. So that's something to be really make sure that you're informed about, and that you know what the consent laws based on age in your state are. And then we have ethical data handling. So educators and staff are going to receive training on ethical data handling. That's the assumption, right? Because they're going to have access to this data. They need to know, what do I do with it besides, analyze it, besides see, did somebody's scores, increase in particular ways, beyond, kind of going into the data to pull out what I might need as a teacher. What else do I need to know about handling this data, right? Like, it might be helpful to tell me, like, don't just leave this open on your laptop and walk off, right? If you got to walk off even for 5 minutes, you need to log out. You should only be looking at it when you're looking at it, right? When you're using it and you're present with it. So think about how the data should be handled, emphasizing, respecting student privacy, emphasizing using data responsibly. And you want to come up with a very clear policy on who does what and how data gets handled. And then data anonymization is super critical. It's not always applicable, right? But where it is, student data is going to be anonymized to protect individual identities. You still want teachers and educators to be able to get the valuable insights that they need so that they can make the instructional improvements that they need to make. So, for example, I do need to know, right, like a certain student, I do need to know if certain students are improving, when it comes to certain skills, or what they have or haven't learned, what they're struggling with. For that, obviously, as a teacher, I would need to know the exact students and how they were performing. So it doesn't always make sense, obviously, to anonymize all of the data that I'm seeing as an educator. But it might make sense to anonymize some of it. So when you're writing this out, what I would recommend is coming up with the things that you think are important to be anonymized. You can lay those out in the policy, or you can just give examples. You'll have to play with that and figure out what works best, for you. But you want to think that through very carefully, and so that we make sure that teachers get the information they need to make sure that students get the instruction that they need. But when we don't need to know whose name is attached to something, then it's anonymized. And then cybersecurity safety measures. So we want to think about cybersecurity training, and incident response plan, and continuous monitoring. So with cybersecurity training, we need to think about who needs this kind of training, right? Is it provided to all educators and staff? Is it provided to just, a subset? And if so, who gets access to that training? But we really want to make people aware of the potential threats and best practices for safeguarding student data. And then incident response plan. So you want to make sure, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but you want to set it up so that your data is obviously stored safely and securely, and you want to minimize the potential for data breaches, right? But we have to have an incident response plan, and this is really where it goes. You want to say, okay, when something happens, here is how we're going to start addressing data breaches or cybersecurity incidents. You want to show your community that we're going to be fast. We're going to be quick on our feet with this. We're going to respond to it super quick, and we're going to mitigate the risk. So there's always this risk that a data breach can happen. What we want to communicate to the community is we're doing everything that we can to minimize this. And if and when it should happen, here's our plan for getting on it ASAP and getting things under control so that minimal data gets out. And then continuous monitoring, right? You have to have regular monitoring and auditing of these data systems. And you're going to want to talk about how are you conducting that, right? How are you looking at your data? How are you looking at these systems to find potential vulnerabilities where you could have, right? Somebody could breach your system, somebody could steal your data. And how are you going to proactively address that? So you want to have a plan in place for those. Okay. Next up, we're going to talk about issues of bias and fairness. And this is something that's really, really critical. You want to talk about how you're going to ensure that your AI tools that your district uses are used in a way that is equitable, fair, and unbiased. So you want to ensure that any AI technologies that you are using promote an equitable and inclusive learning experience for your students or for your staff. And you want to explain if you're going to require the use of diverse data sets in any AI tools that you use and the reason as to why. So diverse data sets, right? The more diverse your data set is, the less likely you are to experience inequities, biases, things that are unfair, right? Or incorrect information, things of that nature. So you want to address that in this document, right? If you're looking at with any AI tool, if they've been trained on diverse data sets. And then you want to identify trainings that are going to be required on how bias can manifest in AI tools. So your teachers aren't, and your students for sure, but your teachers aren't going to necessarily be aware that if a tool has been vetted, that potentially there could be some bias that could pop up. Like, for example, algorithmic bias, data set bias, right? Especially if you're not using diverse data sets, societal biases. There can be different biases that pop up. And you want to be able to help teachers learn how to identify that and what to do when that happens, right? Because if that happens, you're going to want other people are going to want to know about that, are going to want to be made aware of the problem. You might want to revisit if you want to continue to use that particular tool or not, but you are going to want to help teachers learn how to identify those kinds of biases. And then create protocols for ongoing monitoring and evaluation of AI systems so that you can detect and address bias over time. All right. Mitigating bias in AI tools. So as I said, we want diverse data representation because the AI tools that are trained on diverse and representative data sets, the more that happens, the less likely it is that you're going to have the risk of a biased decision making. You're going to run into, things that are inequitable, things that are not inclusive, right? So diverse data sets are very important. Ethical AI development. Ethical guidelines for AI development. You want to use these to establish and emphasize the importance of fairness, transparency, like how do we decide which tools to use and what tools we're not going to use? How do we decide how we're going to implement them? How do we decide how we're, securing and storing our data? You want to be as transparent as possible. And accountability, right? Who takes accountability if something goes wrong? Who takes accountability if something goes right, right? So those are all very important things to explore and establish in your policy document. I'm going to kind of go through this a little quickly because we've touched on it. I think I've kind of beat this to death maybe a little bit, but the importance of diverse data sets, it's going to reflect the demographics, right? It's going to obviously or ideally reflect the demographics of the student population and the broader community that they're in. Risk mitigation, minimizing bias, right, by ensuring that the data sets are inclusive and representative of the entire student population, not just a small subset. And then equitable outcomes. You want to ensure that AI systems provide fair and equitable outcomes for all students. And a key way to know that that's likely going to happen is that they use diverse data sets. So if they're not using, if you're interested in a tool and you find out they did not train it using diverse data sets, it's probably not going to be super equitable or super inclusive. It's still worth looking at, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind and pay attention to. All right, transparency and accountability. Transparency and accountability is incredibly important. You want to explain how AI technologies are being used in educational settings, what the algorithms look like, what their data sources are, how they make decisions, and you want to establish mechanisms for accountability. So like I said earlier, regular audits, reporting requirements, channels for anybody who has concerns or complaints, right? It could be teachers, it could be students, it could be people in the community, it could be students' families, right? So you want to make sure that those channels are in place. So we want clear communication, transparent communication with parents and students and the community, giving them clear information on data practices, privacy measures, right? How data is stored and how it's secured. We want to give them information disclosure, okay? We want comprehensive information about how AI technologies are being used, and that's going to foster transparency. So we want to share details about, like I said, the specific use cases, intended outcomes, like what are we hoping to accomplish through using these tools, and what are the implications of using these tools. And then we need feedback mechanisms. So feedback channels need to be created so that anybody who wants to can voice their concern and provide input, right? It could be providing input on data privacy and security practices. It could be providing input on the tool itself. It could be something a parent saw at home if their child was using an AI tool, but we want some kind of feedback mechanism in place. So if there's any questions, concerns, issues, it can be reported and then addressed immediately. And then accountability practices. So we want to disclose information about AI systems. Doing so shows that we're willing to be accountable, right? We establish our accountability. And it allows stakeholders, our teachers, our students, our families to hold the system and its operators responsible for ethical and fair usage. So we want that dedicated reporting channel, and then we want a prompt investigation. So anything that's coming through that dedicated channel, any report, that gets investigated. And that swift response is going to show commitment to addressing concerns, to listening to them, addressing them, and and continuing to be transparent and accountable in our actions. All right, section 5. So developing a framework for AI procurement. So what you want to do in this section is talk about how you're going to determine if an AI tool should be adopted. And so things that you're going to want to consider, you're going to want to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment to determine how AI tools can best serve your district, perform due diligence on that particular tool, and then pilot that tool in a controlled environment. So what that looks like in more depth. So with the needs assessment, identifying challenges or goals that the AI tool claims it can address and help you with, and then evaluate how well does it actually align with the curriculum standards and the district objectives? And then assessing the potential impact, right? We're not actually, this is just the potential, right? What we think could happen. Assessing the potential impact on student learning outcomes to ensure the tool is going to provide meaningful educational value. And then from there, if that looks pretty good, we move into due diligence. So we're reviewing research and evidence that supports the tool's effectiveness, right? What are its data privacy for that particular tool? What are their privacy and security measures? How do they protect student information? And then assess how well that tool is compatible with your existing technology infrastructure to make sure that if you do adopt it, everything's going to be smoothly integrated and you're not going to have a huge technological issue. And then finally, you're going to want to pilot that tool. So you're going to get comprehensive feedback to understand the tool's practical implications and the experience that teachers or students, whoever was supposed to use that tool, What was their experience like? And then analyze data on the tool's performance and impact to make an informed decision about, do we move forward with this? Did this tool really help us do the things it said it was going to do, and how well did it do it? Okay, section 6, educator training and support. So what you want to do in this section is explain how you're going to be preparing faculty and staff, or possibly students, on how to use AI tools. And with this, you're going to want to explain how professional development opportunities for educators are going to enhance their AI literacy and their proficiency in integrating AI technologies into the classroom effectively and responsibly, and also safely. And then you're going to want to share how you will provide ongoing support and resources for educators so that they keep up with the best practices and emerging trends in AI education. Because as I'm sure you know, that's a lot to keep up with. And it's one more thing piled on teachers' plates. And it's going to go to the, I think it's going to go to the bottom, because it's the one that's probably not exactly yelling the loudest, right? It doesn't need the most attention. So if you want teachers to stay on top of emerging trends, if you want them to be using these tools effectively and well, then we're going to have to figure out a way for how we're going to provide that information, that support, that training, those resources to them, because I think, as we all know, they don't necessarily have time to go out and find those on their own. And then we want to identify any education and training stakeholders who are going to receive will receive ethical principles related to AI technologies. So training around issues as fairness, transparency, accountability, respect for privacy, things of that nature. All right, so educator training, diving into this a little bit more. We want a tailored professional development program to be designed to give teachers the knowledge and skills they need to effectively use AI tools in their teaching practices. So having a roadmap, having an outline of what does that look like? What kinds of opportunities do teachers have? Where are these professional development programs coming from? Who's doing them? That's going to be very critical here. And then we want curated resources, right? We want lesson plans, instructional materials, online tutorials, video, anything you can think of, right? That is going to help teachers seamlessly integrate AI technologies into their teaching practices. So as much as we can pull together resources for teachers to use, that's going to help them outside of a formal professional development program. And then consider creating a community of practice. So, establishing a community of practice where teachers can, collaborate, they can share knowledge, they can stay informed about best practices and emerging trends in AI education. All right, section 7 is student well-being. And so here you want to talk about how you will ensure that student safety is maintained in relation to their use of AI tools. So you're going to want to identify how you will prioritize the well-being and safety of students in the development and deployment of AI tools. How are you going to protect against harmful or inappropriate content? Because that will be a big question that comes up quite frequently. And then you want to create guidelines for monitoring and addressing any potential negative impacts of AI on student mental health and well-being. And then explain how you will ensure that AI technologies are designed with accessibility in mind to accommodate students with diverse needs and abilities. And you're going to want to share how you will promote the development of inclusive AI solutions that address the unique learning requirements of all students. So, for example, students with disabilities, students whose native language is not English, right? There's obviously a number of avenues that we can go down here, but how are we going to make sure that the AI tool promotes inclusivity and is accessible for the students that it's meant to be accessible for? All right. Ensuring safe and supportive environments. So we want to empower students. We want to create an environment with these tools where students feel safe and they feel empowered to use these technologies, right? This involves engaging students in open communication, providing them with the tools, giving them the resources to navigate potential challenges, helping them understand what these tools can and can't do. We want parental involvement. That's obviously super critical. So we want to engage parents and guardians in discussions about AI technology use and safety so that they're informed and they can support their child at home. And then educational initiatives. We want to implement educational programs and initiatives to raise awareness about safe and responsible use of AI technology so that really what you're doing is fostering this culture of digital well-being and safety, and the community knows that that is what you value and that is what you're going for with these tools. Okay, and then with the safe and supportive environment, we want to make sure, as we've said, that the tools are inclusive so that they promote inclusivity, that they address the diverse needs of students, that access and equity, that all students have equitable access to these tools, and that we have resource support. We want to provide students with access to resources and support services to address any challenges or issues that might rise from their interaction with AI technologies, right? We want to empower students while also keeping them safe. All right, section 8 is parents and community engagement. And so in this section of your policy brief, you're going to want to talk about how you're going to work with parents and families and the community as a whole to help educate them about AI, because they're going to have questions, they're going to have concerns. And topics you're going to want to consider. You're going to want to explain how you will communicate with parents, families, and the broader community about the district's use of AI technologies in education. You're going to want to create a plan for how you're going to solicit feedback from everyone and what you're going to do with that to make sure that that your stakeholders, your community members, that their thoughts and ideas on AI-related policies and practices, right? You want to take those into consideration and look with how what you're doing aligns with community values and priorities. And then you want to communicate what parents and families should do if they have questions or concerns about the use of AI in your district. And that gets back to the point earlier about having some kind of a reporting mechanism, right? Where they see something, they hear something, they have a question, they have a way to know that that question is heard and responded to in some manner. And then we want to foster community engagement, right? We want to have these information channels. We want to have opportunities for parents and community members to come together to ask questions, voice concerns, get more information, as well as provide their feedback. And we want to make sure that we're collaborating with community organizations. So talking about how you're actively seeking opportunities to collaborate with parents and community organizations is going to be really critical to have in your policy brief. And then we're promoting awareness and understanding, right? You're having informational sessions and workshops is something that you can do, right? Providing informational sessions and seminars on topics about AI education. You can provide resources for parents and community members about AI technology, about how it's going to be used in your district, and you can foster discussions around that as well. So those are some ideas that you might want to take up or talk through in preparing your document. Okay, section 9, evaluation and continuous improvement. So we want to explain how are we continually evaluating these AI tools. So we want to be able to explain in this section processes for how we're evaluating the effectiveness of the AI technologies on teaching and learning outcomes, right? So we know what tools work, what tools don't work for us, what we want to keep and what we don't want to keep, right? And then we want to share how data-driven insights can be used to refine AI-related policies, because this policy that you're making, right, it's a work in progress. It's going to need to be revisited. It's going to be refined. And one of the ways that you can do that is through data. And so talk about how data-driven insights are going to shape your policy going forward, how it's going to shape and inform practices over time so that families and the community feel good and confident that what you're doing with these tools is aligned with the district's educational goals. Continuous evaluation and improvement. We want to think about performance metrics, feedback loops, which we've talked a lot about, and adaptive implementation. So for performance metrics, obviously, we want to make sure we have clear performance metrics for AI tools. We want to make sure that we know what they are before we adopt the tool. But we want to be able to have this ongoing evaluation for how effective any given tool is and making sure that it is aligned with the educational outcomes, right, that are important to your district. Feedback loops, we've talked, I think, a lot about, so I'm going to just pass over that. And then adaptive implementation. We want to adopt an adaptive approach to AI tool implementation, right? So we want this iterative improvement process and adjustments based on feedback and evolving educational needs. All right, and then section 10, and then we will have time for questions, rollout plans. So think about how you're rolling out AI tools in your district. And so you're going to want to consider things like creating a plan for systematically implementing AI tools so that you minimize disruption, but you're maximizing the benefits. So you're not going to most likely want to hand an AI tool to everybody all at once. You're going to want to slowly, roll it out in your district over time. And you're going to want to identify the resources you're going to need to be successful with, what kind of hardware you need, software, personnel, etc. And for any given tool, when you roll it out, you're going to want to have a clear and concise plan for the goals, the outcomes, the expectations that you have, right? And that's going to allow you, obviously, to track it and see and evaluate it and see how well it's doing and if you should keep it or not. And then share those timelines, right? This gets back to transparency and accountability, sharing those timelines for when and how AI tools will be rolled out. And then finally, just making sure you have with the rollout plan a systematic implementation. So we're minimizing the disruptions. You're having resource management, right? We're on top of everything that we need, and we have expectation management, right? We know what we want out of this, and we know about how long it should take before we can see if we hit our goal, right? We want realistic goals, timelines, and outcomes for that AI implementation. And that is a lot of information. And I think, Christine, am I handing it back to you for questions?
You're staying with me for questions. So
staying with you, yes. Okay.
Yeah, stay with me, please. Wow is all I have to say. And please take a drink because I was hoping you had a Gatorade at the ready. So amazing and super helpful. And for everybody in the audience, this is recorded, so we will send the link later so you can have a chance to go through and go through all these points, because you've hit on so many points, things we hear a lot about at Tech and Learning. So thank you for that. And then, of course, please share the recording with your colleagues as you work collaboratively on developing your AI guidelines. So yes, we do have some time left for questions. So we've gotten a bunch, and I know our Merlin friends have been answering some as we go along, but let me start with a question. We are concerned about privacy and data governance when using AI. So what kind of safeguards are available for dealing with that, if you have some advice there? Can
you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. So, so this attendee said their district is concerned about privacy and data governance. We hear a lot about who owns the data when using AI. So are there safeguards available for dealing with that? Any general advice regarding that?
That's a great question. And I don't know if anybody on this call happens to know about safeguards that are in place for that. If you do, I mean, I think people put it in the chat if they have some ideas and thoughts on that while I start talking. Christine, does that work?
Yeah, that's fine. So the Merlin team, you can always respond directly for that. And it's okay to pass it along if you want to move to the next question or if you want to address any piece of that.
Well, I do want to say, I think it's really important to make sure that, if you're if you're adopting an AI tool, you definitely want to know who owns the data, right? And I think that's the question, right? Like, who owns it? Do you as a district own it, or do the people that developed the tool own it? And I think that's a question, and that's, I think, something to put in the policy document, right? We didn't talk about it today, and there's things obviously that you're going to want to put in this document that we couldn't get to today. But I think that's something that you're going to want to look into. Who owns the data? How long do they have rights to that data? And when that data is, supposed to be destroyed, right? You can't have possession of it anymore. What are the protocols for getting rid of that data? And so if I was considering adopting a tool for my district, that I would ask them that, right? Who owns the data? And if they say they own the data, what does that mean? And getting that information from them and understanding what you have access to versus what maybe you don't have access to, and ultimately who has access to what, because that's a question that could likely come from parents.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another question, if districts disclose their use of AI to generate some of their curriculum course content in their policy, do individual educators within the districts need to cite their use of AI?
So that's a great question. So it's like I used AI to create a piece of curriculum, right? And then I give it to you. And you as a teacher are using that piece of curriculum. Do you need to tell somebody that AI created it?
That's the question. Yeah.
That's the question. Yeah. That's an interesting question. I actually don't know. I do know that like lately, like, and you see this online, like with some, like I think it's like with Instagram has it where you have to check off if something was made by AI, you have to clearly mark it. So you are starting to see this now, right? Where there's sort of like a ranking system or a grading system or an acknowledgement in some way of like was made by AI, right? And how much of it was maybe made by AI. I don't have an official answer to that. I think it's a great question that should be explored and discussed within your district. I think that's going to have to be my stance for the moment. I think it'd be an interesting conversation to have.
I 100% agree, because it all goes back to good citations, copyright,
Mm-hmm.
who owns it, etc. Okay, here's another one. Since AI is so new to all of us, how can we avoid, this is kind of a big question, so how can we avoid the misuse of AI and set restrictions to use of it by students? So
okay. It's how can we restrict the misuse of AI?
It's sort of two parts. How can we avoid the misuse of AI? So
in general,
in general, and then how can we set restrictions to use of it by students? And that raises the question, of course, just maybe what's the best policy when students are using AI to create their own work?
Right. I mean, so okay. I think I probably need a little more information to answer this, but I'll start. And if the person who wrote it wants to add maybe some more information to the chat, that could be helpful.
Sure.
Because you're on the one hand, right? Like if you're using a tool that was developed for schools, that was developed specifically for students to use, then you would want to explore, right? Like how safe it is, right? When you're exploring that tool and deciding if you want to adopt it and looking for, are there any ways that students could misuse that tool? And then potentially having a conversation, right, with the company if you kind of come up with some ways that students could misuse it. But I guess what I'm thinking about is if you're using a tool that was designed for students, then I think it's a safe assumption that the people that designed it don't want students to be able to do wildly inappropriate things with it, and have probably already put all of those guardrails up. So really, are we talking about like AI, like a chat GPT kind of a thing where students can get into AI and be using it?
I'm sort of reading, I mean, to me, I always think it falls back to just good digital citizenship. And the tool is AI, but the tool has been many other things. So, and I think so our Merlin friends are answering some of these in the back end, maybe getting a little bit more information about that. But I wanted to get to this question, if that's okay to move on to another one, unless you want to elaborate. Okay.
Sure.
I hear this a lot. How do we address AI risks and concerns with parents? I think
okay. So how do you address AI risks and concerns with parents? Yeah, we touched on it a little bit. I think what you want to do first is make sure that you understand what their risks, what their concerns are, right? Because until we understand what their concerns are, you don't know really how to address it. So my first thing would be you need to have a forum, have a way, right, for parents to come in, community members to come in and have a discussion about AI tools, and even giving them like some background on it, what it's going to accomplish, what it's not going to accomplish, what are the limitations of it, right? All of that we talked about earlier with the transparency and the guardrails that you have in place, right? That should be helpful. But I think to address their concerns, we have to know what they are. And we have to know like what are the top 3, 4, 5 concerns, and then we can look at those, right, and develop a strategy for how are we gonna respond to them. But so that's what I would do, is I would get really clear on what those are. But besides that, right, making sure that you have those plans in place for how you're going to evaluate AI tools, how you're going to make decisions about what tools are used and what tools are not going to be used, how you're going to store data, how you're going to respect privacy. I think that will get at a lot of concerns.
Yeah. And you mentioned just clear communication and transparency, which I'm so glad you said that, because that is highly important. Kind of related to that, piggyback a little bit. So who are the stakeholders we should include in our policy development? That was another question that came in. That
is a great question. So there's a thing about, and I'm trying to imagine this like a big, like you're steering this big ship here. You don't want to get it too out of control. So I'm going to assume, right, like you're going to want to have a conversation. I don't know within your district who the most appropriate person is, that you're going to want to have a conversation that gets at that question, because I'm sure that whatever I answer today, I'm forgetting something. There's somebody I've left out. So I would make sure that whoever is the appropriate person to have that conversation with, have that conversation so you can make sure that everybody gets identified that needs to get identified. But I would make sure to have, right, some parents, some community members on that committee, right? That's going to help you get at questions and concerns. And they can be that vehicle where they are going out, maybe leading some discussions in the community around AI tools and bringing that information back as you're drafting the policy. I would consider, and I'm not married to this idea, but I would at least consider putting a couple of students on it as well, some high school students, to get some input from students about their concerns, their experiences with AI. You know, getting back at this previous question about misuse of AI and student restrictions, if you or student maybe misusing AI and having to put restrictions on a tool, if you get some students out in the student community and they can access other students and hear their concerns and have conversations with them, they can bring that information back, and that could be very helpful as well. You want to think about staff, anybody that's going to come into contact or be affected by these AI tools. I would have them be a part of the policy or have a way for them to provide input on the policy, right? Because if you get too many people at the table, then the challenge becomes who's writing this document? How is this document getting written? But it could be useful to have sort of some subgroups that are maybe collecting information, having some discussions, bringing that information back to you so that you can then synthesize it and use it, right, to write the policy brief from, and then send that back out and to get some input and feedback on it.
I love that answer. I'm glad you said students, but I also am glad you said if you get too many people at the table, it becomes a little
well, there's this thing about we want
you kind of scale down. You start with a big net, and then you
right, and yeah. And I think there's a way to make it big and just maybe have, like I said, subgroups, and then have a core group that's writing the document. So yeah.
Great advice. Another question. So how can we ensure that AI tools will have a positive effect on student outcomes?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess we can't really ensure that, right? But you want to take the tool. Okay, if a tool says that it's going to help improve students' reading comprehension in particular ways, right? Then the only way that you can ensure, there's a couple ways that you can ensure that it's doing that, right? One is if they've got data and reports and research that shows how their tool has performed, I would look at that. And I would ask them for any supporting research that they have as well that goes along with that tool. Outside of any, like, here's data that we have, here's how it's performed in situations that are similar to yours, then you have to use the tool, right? You have to use the tool. You have to know where your students were when they started using the tool, maybe do a midpoint assessment, do a post assessment, and then look at how well that tool performed. And did it perform in the ways that it said it was going to perform? And did it perform for the students that it said it was going to perform for? So I think some of it's about, just looking at the data that the company that's created the tool has, and some of it's going to be trying it and making that decision about if it's worth continuing on or not.
Yeah. Kind of like any tool, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the last question we have here that hasn't already been addressed, I already have the answer. It says, is there a template or checklist we can use to help our district? My answer would be watch this webinar again, because I feel, unless there's another checklist, but I will say you've covered so much, and I wanted to point folks to the handout at the bottom there, because Merlin Mind, that's their responsible AI section. But if there are any other resources you wanted to share, Lee, that feel free.
We do have, I believe, on that site a checklist for how to evaluate tools, AI tools. If you're a teacher, if you're an administrator, right, there's 2 different checklists, so you can access that through that as well.
Perfect. Thank you. This has been amazing. And so I do want to remind everybody, it's been recorded. Hang on to that link, share it with your colleagues. Thank you to Lee, it was amazing, and to our sponsor, Merlin Mind, for making this conversation possible, and for adding that link to their site. And now I do have the pleasure of naming the winner of our $250 Amazon gift card. Drum roll, please. The winner is Leslie Victorine from Massachusetts. So congratulations, Leslie. And thank you again to Lee and to Merlin Mind and to all of you for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to seeing you at the next Tech and Learning Lunch and Learn webinar. So have a wonderful day.